Good afternoon. It's just a couple of minutes past 4 p.m. I'm continuing with Butler's, the saints, the lives of the saints. I'm just going to share just one or two prayers before I begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Holy Michael, Archangel, defend me in this day of battle. Be my safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, I humbly pray. And do thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust down to hell Satan and all the wicked evil spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of souls. Amen. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To you do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To you do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, your eyes of mercy towards us, and after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of your womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary. Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love entrusts me here, ever this day be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. Amen. Going to be reading from Butler's the following saints or blesseds for the 15th of July, which was yesterday. I'd already written the list and ran out of time. Saint Henry the Emperor, AD 1024. Saint James, Bishop of NISIBIS, AD 338. Saint BARHADBESABA, Martyr, AD 355. Saint Donald, 8th century. Saint SWITHUN, Bishop of Winchester, AD 862. Saint ATHANASIUS, Bishop of Naples, AD 872. Saint Edith of Polesworth, 10th century. Saint VLADIMIR of KIEV, AD 1015. Saint David of MUNKTORP, Bishop, AD 1080. Blessed Bernard of Baden, AD 1458. Blessed Ignatius, AZEVEDO and his companions, martyrs, AD 1570. Saint Pompilio, PIRROTTI, AD 1756. Blessed Anne Mary, JAVOUHEY Virgin, foundress of the congregation of Saint Joseph of CLUNY, AD 185. The life of Saint Henry the Emperor, AD 1024. Saint Henry II was son of Henry, Duke of Bavaria, and Gisela of Burgundy, and was born in 972. He was educated by Saint Wolfgang, Bishop of Ratisbon, and in 995 succeeded his father in the Duchy of Bavaria. In 1002, upon the death of his cousin Otto III, he was chosen emperor. He had always before his eyes, the dangers to which those who move in places of power are exposed. He studied the extent and importance of the obligations which attended his dignity, and by prayer maintained in his heart the necessary spirit of humility and fear, and was able, without being spoiled, to bear the tide of prosperity and honour. He knew the end for which alone he was exalted by God to the highest temporal dignity, and worked his hardest. Sorry, I have a cold. Sorry. And importance of obligations which attended his dignity, and by prayer maintained in his heart the necessary spirit of humility and fear, and was able, without being spoiled, to bear the tide of prosperity and honour. He knew the end for which alone he was exalted by God to the highest temporal dignity, and worked his hardest to promote the peace and happiness of his realm. Nevertheless, Henry at times made use of the Church for political ends, in accordance with the imperial policy of his predecessor Otto the Great. He refused his support to ecclesiastical aggrandizement in temporal concerns, while maintaining the Church's proper authority. But some of his politics looked equivocal when examined from the point of view of the welfare of Christendom. He had to engage in numerous wars for the defence and consolidation of the empire, as for example in Italy, before he could receive that crown. Arduin of Ivrea had had himself crowned king at Milan, so the emperor crossed the Alps and drove him out. In 1014 he went to triumph in Rome, where he was crowned emperor by Pope Benedict the 8th. Henry munificently repaired and restored the episcopal sees of Hildesheim, Magdeburg, Strasbourg, and Meisburg, and made benefactions to the churches of Aachen, Bâle, and others. It is sometimes mistakenly asserted that he brought about the conversion of Saint Stephen, King of Hungary, who in fact was born of Christian parents, but he promoted his endeavours for the conversion of his people. In 1006, Henry founded the See of Bamberg and built a great cathedral there, in order to solidify German power among the Wends. In this he was opposed by the bishops of Würzburg and Eichstätt, whose dioceses were thus dismembered by Pope John the 14th, approved, and Benedict the 8th consecrated the cathedral in 1020. Henry also built and endowed a monastery at Bamberg and made foundations in several other places, that the divine honour and the relief of the poor might be provided for to the end of time. In 1021, the emperor again came to Italy on an expedition against the Greeks in Apulia. On his way back, he was taken ill at Monte Cassino, where he was said to have been miraculously cured at the intercession of Saint Benedict, but he contracted a lameness which never left him. Henry was attentive to the smallest affairs amidst the multiplicity of business which attends the government of the state, and whilst he was most active and vigilant in every duty which he owed to the public, he did not forget that the government of himself was his first obligation. He identified himself in time with those ideas of ecclesiastical reform which radiated from the great monastery of Cluny, and in support of them he even opposed himself to his kinsman, friend and former chaplain, AZEVEDO, whom he had appointed Archbishop of Mainz, and who in synod had condemned appeals to Rome without episcopal permission. It is a well-known story of Henry that, wishing to become a monk, he promised obedience to the abbot of St. Van at Verdun, whereupon the abbot put him under obedience to continue the administration of the empire. This and similar accounts of his ascetic practices do not entirely accord with what is known of his character and life. Henry was one of the great rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, and triumphed precisely as a Christian statesman and soldier, whose ways were, in the nature of things, not those of the cloister. Edifying legends were invented about him by the Bambergers, and such a work as Adalbert's Life of the Emperor does not give us the real Henry. What we know of him is mostly a matter of general history. Unlike St. Louis of France, St. Henry II did not have a Joinville. He clearly promoted ecclesiastical reform, taking great care about episcopal appointments and supporting such great monks as St. Odilo of Cluny and Richard of St. Van. Henry was canonized by Blessed Eugenius III in 1146, and St. Pius X declared him the patron of Benedictine Oblates. I can't read what's underneath, the font is too small, so I'll continue with St. James now, Bishop of NISIBIS, AD 338. This is one of the cases in which all Alban Butler's diligence and learning could not save him from error, for it was not till long after his time that the life of St. James of NISIBIS received the critical study that it demanded. Accordingly, he accorded several pages to an account of a saint about whom very little is in fact known. That James was an important figure, venerated throughout the East from early times, is quite certain. He is recognized liturgically in practically every Eastern church, and he is mentioned in the Hieronymian martyrology. He became the first bishop of Nisibis in Mesopotamia about the year 308, and St. Ephraim, his disciple, refers to the importance of his services to that church, for which he built a great basilica and, perhaps, inaugurated its famous theological school. He was present at the Council of Nicaea in 325, and Saint Athanasius, the historian Theodoret, present at the Council of Nicaea in 325, and others record that he was an outstanding opponent of Arianism. The Roman martyrology refers to the fable that St. James's prayers contributed to bring Arius to a shocking end at Constantinople. When the Persian king, Sapor II, made his first attack on Nisibis in 338, the bishop was still alive, but there is good evidence that he died in that same year. Butler remarks that St. James's learning and writings had procured him a rank next to St. Ephraim among the doctors of the Syrian Church, and that the Armenians too honour him as a doctor. But it is now known that the writings formerly attributed to him are not his. He is named in the canon of the Syrian and Maronite Mass, and in the festal litany of the Chaldean. The next martyr is Saint BARHADBESABA, AD 355. It's very short. So in the year 340, the church in Persia began to undergo one of the most intense persecutions that any body of Christians have suffered. In the 15th year of the persecution, by the command of Sapor Tamsapor, governor of Adiabene, BARHADBESABA, deacon of the city of Arbela, was apprehended and put on the rack. While he was tormented, the officers continually cried out to him, "Worship fire and water, and eat the blood of beasts, you shall be set at liberty." But the deacon said to the judge, "Neither you nor your king, nor any manner of suffering, shall ever be able to separate me from the love of Jesus. Him alone have I served from my childhood to this old age." The tyrant condemned him to be beheaded and commanded Agai, an apostate Christian, to be his executioner. BARHADBESABA stood bound, waiting with joy for the moment which was to associate him with the angels. But Agai trembled so as not to be able to give the blow. He struck, however, 7 times at the martyr's neck, and not being able to sever his head from his body, ran his sword into him. The judge set guards to watch the body, but 2 clerks carried it off in the night and buried it. Sounds so sad. Saint Donald, 8th century. All that is recorded of this saint, whose name is so common in Scotland, is that he lived at Ogilvy in FORFARSHIRE in the 8th century, that his wife bore him 9 daughters, and that on her death they formed a sort of community who led the religious life under his direction. But if no more is known of him, he has nevertheless left his mark otherwise, for the often found natural features, wells, hills, and so on, which are known as the 9 maidens, are so called in the memory of his daughters. They are said to have afterwards entered a monastery founded by St. Darlugdash and St. Bridget at Abernethy, and were commemorated on July 18th. The popularity of the name in Scotland must be attributed not to veneration for the saint, but to the ubiquity of the sons of Somerled of the Isles, Clan Donald. It's a shame. I'd have liked to know more, wouldn't it? It sounds so like you haven't heard enough. Saint Swithin, Bishop of Winchester, AD 862. Swithin was born in Wessex at the end of the 8th century or beginning of the 9th, and passed his youth in the study of grammar, philosophy, and the Holy Scriptures at the old monastery in Winchester, of which, however, he was probably never a member. Being ordained priest, his learning, piety, and prudence moved Egbert, king of the West Saxons, to make him his chaplain, under which title the saint subscribed a charter granted to the Abbey of Croyland in 833. That prince also committed to his care the education of his son Ethelwulf, and made use of his counsels in the government of his kingdom. On the death of Egbert, Ethelwulf succeeded, and he governed his kingdom by the prudent advice of Aelfstan, Bishop of Sherborne, in temporal affairs, and of Saint Swithin in ecclesiastical matters, especially those which concerned his own soul. Bearing always the greatest reverence to Swithin, he procured him upon the death of Helmstan to be chosen Bishop of Winchester, to which see he was consecrated by Ceolnoth, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 852. William of Malmesbury says that this good bishop was a treasury of all virtues, and those in which he took most delight were humility and charity to the poor. In the discharge of his episcopal functions, he omitted nothing belonging to a true pastor. He built several churches and repaired others, and when he had to dedicate any church, he used to go barefoot to the place. He died on July the 2nd, 862, and at his own request was buried in the churchyard, where his grave might be trodden by passers-by and the rain fall upon it. But his feast is observed in the diocese of Portsmouth and Southwark on July 15th, on which date, over 100 years after, his relics were taken up and translated, moved, that is, into the church, which legend says was done in accordance with a vision of the saint granted to a poor labourer. Malmesbury affirms that a great number of miraculous cures of all kinds were wrought on this occasion. In the reign of William the Conqueror, Walkerlin, Bishop of Winchester, laid the foundation of a new cathedral church, and on July 15th, 1093, the shrine of St. Swithin was translated or moved from the old to the new church. Swithin is still in memory of the English people by reason of the superstition that if it rains on his feast day, it will rain for 40 days after, and the opposite. Many ingenious attempts have been made to explain this belief, but no one of them is convincing. Saint Gervais and Protais, and Saint Medard in France, and Saint Suid in Wales. The next saint is Saint Athanasius, Bishop of Naples, AD 870. This Athanasius became Bishop of Naples about the year 850, when he was not yet 20 years old. He was a native of the city, of which his father had been dux, and took much trouble for both its material and moral improvement. He repaired or built anew the buildings. I'm going to have to put the book down a bit now. Or built anew the buildings overset and despoiled by the Saracens, founded a hospice for pilgrims and the aged, and set on foot a scheme for the ransom of Christians captured by the Mohammedans or Muslims. In 863, he took part in the Council of the Lateran, summoned by Pope St. Nicholas I, whereas St. Ignatius was declared to be lawful patriarch of Constantinople. But St. Athanasius, having thus assisted the father of Christendom to vindicate justice on behalf of a bishop oppressed by the civil power, became himself victim of a similar oppression. The dukedom of Naples had come into the hands of Sergius II, an ambitious and troublesome tyrant whose private life was as unscrupulous as his public politics. On every count, he was no friend of the good Athanasius, and his enmity was aggravated by the fact that the bishop was his uncle, and so had personal as well as official right to call him to order, and he was not afraid to do so, but sharply rebuked his nephew for simoniacal dealings and other disorders. Thereupon, instigated by his wife, Sergius clapped Athanasius into jail at Sorrento. The indignation of the Neapolitans frightened him into setting him at liberty again, but he continued to pursue the bishop with threats and hampered his work in every possible way, so that in 871 Athanasius left Naples and installed himself on the island of the Saviour nearby. Here Sergius promised him peace and freedom from persecution if he sorry, I'll have to have a sip of drink. I'll drop something onto the floor. Never mind. Thank you. Here Sergius promised him peace and freedom from persecution if he would resign his see. When Athanasius refused, he sent troops to bring him back by force, which they were prevented from doing by the intervention of the Western Emperor Louis II, who had the bishop taken in safety to Benevento by the Duke of Amalfi. Sergius retorted by plundering the episcopal treasury at Naples and venting his anger on the bishop's supporters with such violence that the Pope, Adrian II, excommunicated him. The Emperor Louis again took up the bishop's cause and was about to restore him to his see by the force of the imperial authority and strength, when death overtook Saint Athanasius at Veroli near Monte Cassino on July the 15th, 872. It's astonishing reading some of these stories of wealthy kings and bishops and holy people, all how they lived. It was incredible. So I'm continuing now with a 10th century saint. Don't know the dates, there's no dates, it just says 10th century. Saint Edith of Polesworth. Saint Edith of Polesworth. From the conflicting references to Saint Edith of Polesworth, it has sometimes been supposed that there were several English women thus styled, one of whom is mentioned in the Lives of Saint Modwenna, July the 6th. Gosselin, in his Life of Saint Edith of Wilton, speaks of her holy aunt, Edith of Polesworth, sister of King Edgar, while another suggestion is that she is that sister of King Athelstan, said to have been called Edith, who, in 925, married Sihtric, the Viking king at York. He died in the following year, and his widow, who seems to have had the repute of holiness, was eventually buried at Tamworth, only a few miles from Polesworth. On the whole, she may be regarded as probably the one and only Saint Edith called of Polesworth. These perplexities are set out in some detail by Stanton in his Menology, and that's all there is about that saint. Now, the next saint is Saint Vladimir of Kiev, proving that Kiev belonged to the Russians as far back as AD 1015, for those who are historians like I'm interested in history. So Saint Vladimir of Kiev was a Russian. The earliest saints of Russia, princes and monks, were connected with Kiev, which, believe it or not, Russia is a Christian country. Yes, it was part of the Soviet Union and it's run by communists, but it's still got a lot of Orthodox Christians there. So let me continue. With Kiev in the southwest, the God-protected mother of Russian cities, now the capital of what we call the Ukraine, which is currently at war, goaded on by NATO and the Americans, because they want to depose the elected leader Putin, who is called all sorts of names which have not been proven, only spread without facts, because he's been elected. He's not what they accuse him of. But this is the times when there's just lies and lies and lies now. And that war could have been avoided if the puppet Russian-speaking Zelensky was allowed to make peace, which he was not. Boris from UK went over there under direction of Biden and NATO and made him continue a war with Russia that was not needed, and we're still in danger now of having a nuclear war, seconds away literally. So let me continue. I'll start again. The earliest saints of Russia, princes and monks were connected with Kiev in the southwest, the God-protected mother of Russian cities, now the capital of what we call the Ukraine, and in those days a centre of a principality whose Finnish Slav people were ruled by the princes of Scandinavian origin, Varangians who, as pirates and traders, had penetrated into Russia by its waterways. During the last quarter of the 10th century, the Grand Prince of Kiev was Vladimir, a man not only reared in idolatry, but one who freely indulged in the barbarous excesses that were available to one in his position. He was brutal and bloodthirsty, and a contemporary Arabian chronicler, Ibn Fozlan, comments on his 5 wives and numerous female slaves, which supports the statement of the Chronicle of Nestor that Vladimir's desire for women was too much for him. The circumstances of this prince's conversion to Christianity have been and still are much debated, but converted he was, probably in the year 989, when he was about 32, and he then received in marriage Anne, daughter of the Emperor Basil II at Constantinople. The two events were closely connected, and the conversion of the Russian people is dated from then. The fact that pious writers have attributed perfect purity of motive to Vladimir, when undoubtedly he was moved in great measure by the prospect of political and economic advantages from an alliance with the Byzantines and the Christian Church, must not be allowed to obscure that once having accepted Christianity, he is said to have been wholehearted in his adherence to it. He put away his former wives and mistresses and amended his life. He had idols publicly thrown down and destroyed, and he supported the Greek missionaries with energy and enthusiasm. Indeed, with an excess of energy, for at times he did not stop short of conversion by force. To refuse baptism was to incur penalties. But quite apart from that sort of thing, the speed with which the Russians became Christian has been much exaggerated, and during the reign of Vladimir, the new religion probably did not penetrate far beyond the Kievan nobility and wealthy merchants, nor was its subsequent spreading so fast as has been represented. Excuse me, I have a bad throat for a moment. Thank you. Nor was its subsequent spreading so fast as has been represented. Paganism gave ground, but slowly. Nevertheless, he was revered in after years, not only because he was a sinner who repented, but because he brought about the reconciliation of the Russian people with God. He was the apostle of Russia, chosen from on high for that end. The devil was overcome by fools and madmen, says the Chronicle of Nestor, and emphasizes that Saint Vladimir received God's grace and forgiveness, while many righteous and godly men strayed from the path of uprightness and perished. And it would seem that his repentance and understanding of his new obligations were that of simple, straightforward kind, which will forever remain at the heart of the most developed and complex Christianity. When he had, in a moment of passion, fallen into sin, he at once sought to make up for it by penitence and almsgiving, says a chronicler. It is said that he even had scruples whether, now that he was a Christian, he was entitled to punish robbers or even murderers by putting them to death. Such ideas astonished the sophisticated Greek ecclesiastics, who appealed to examples in the Old Testament and Roman history to show that punishment of the wicked was the duty of a Christian prince. But Vladimir seems to have been only half convinced. The circumstances of Vladimir's conversion brought his people within the Byzantine Patriarch, but he was not particularist. He exchanged ambassadors with the Apostolic Court of Rome. He helped the German bishop Saint Boniface Bruno of Querfurt in his mission to the Pechenegs, and he even borrowed certain canonical features from the West, notably the institution of tithes, which were unknown to the Byzantines. Not till the Mongol invasions was Christian Russia cut off from the West. Saint Vladimir died in 1015, after, as it is said, giving away all his personal belongings to his friends and to the poor. His feast is solemnly celebrated by the Russians, Ukrainians, and others. That's interesting. I'm actually thinking of doing that recording again, all on its own, because we should pray for the Ukrainians and we should pray for the Russians. And the leadership is no good in Ukraine because it's false. They elected that actor, Zelensky, on a ticket of signing peace with Russia. And I think Putin gets a bad press, so they need prayers as well. We have to pray for both of them. So now St. David of MUNKTORP, Bishop, AD 1080. This David is said to have been an English monk who had a passionate desire to give his life for Christ by martyrdom. When he heard of the death at the hands of the heathen of St. Siegfried's 3 nephews, he offered himself to the English mission in Sweden, which was trying to rebuild the spoiled work of St. Ansgar. He came to St. Frigid, who was Bishop of Vaxio, and was sent to Västmanland. Here he laboured for the conversion of the people, and to help in the work established a monastery, whence the place was afterwards known as MUNKTORP. He gave himself wholeheartedly to his mission with great success. He received the gift of miracles, and even more value, gift of tears. But the grace of martyrdom for which he longed was denied. He lived instead to a considerable age and died peacefully, his sanctity being again confirmed by miracles at his tomb. David is commonly said to have been the first bishop of Västerås, and is one of the saints of whom it was told that he hung a garment on a sunbeam, in this case his gloves. Davos, where he lived for a time, gets its name from Saint David. The Blessed is the next one. Blessed Bernard of Baden, AD 1458. Among the descendants of Hermann von Zähringen, who gave up the Margravate of Baden to become a Cluniac monk, was the Margrave James I, who was known in his day as the Solomon of Germany. He married Catherine, the daughter of Charles II of Lorraine and Margaret of Bavaria, and to them was born a son, Bernard, about the year 1429. He turned out a brilliant young man with a taste both for letters and for soldiering, but he refused to betroth himself to the daughter of the King of France, and when his father died in 1453, he turned his responsibilities and rights as Margrave over to his brother Charles and went from court to court of Europe, trying to stir up their sovereigns to a crusade against the Turks, who on May the 29th, 1453, had captured Constantinople. Bernard set out for Rome to get the support of Pope Callistus III, but just after leaving Turin, he was attacked by the plague and died in the Franciscan monastery at Montcagliari, being less than 30 years old. On account of his great reputation for sanctity, supported by miracles reported at his tomb, he was beatified in 1479 by Pope Sixtus IV, in the presence of his mother and brothers. Blessed Ignatius Azevedo and his companions and martyrs, AD 1570. Ignatius Azevedo came from a family of wealth and rank on both his father's and mother's side. He was born at Oporto in 1528 and joined the Society of Jesus when he was 20. He proved to be a model novice, except that his physical mortifications made him so thin that the Portuguese provincial father, Simon Rodrigues, had to remonstrate with him. When he was still only 25, he was made rector of the College of St. Anthony at Lisbon. Here he did not confine himself to the strict limits of his official duties, but was active in every good work. It is recorded that on one occasion he personally tended 3 men in such advanced stages of some loathsome disease that the ordinary hospitallers would not touch them, and by caring for their bodies he converted their souls. With a brief interval as vice-provincial of Portugal, Father Azevedo persevered in this office for 10 years and was then removed to a similar post at the college in Braga, founded by the famous Dominican Archbishop Bartholomew Fernandez, a martyribus. All this time he had been beset by a desire, kindled by a Japanese student at Lisbon, to preach the gospel to the heathen, and at length, in 1566, he was appointed to go to Brazil as visitor to inspect and advise on the Jesuit missions there. He was away on this commission for 2 years. The first missionaries had landed in Brazil only 17 years previously, but Jesuits had already established residences among several of the cannibal tribes of that huge country. On his return to Rome, he recommended to St. Francis Borgia that more missionaries be sent out there, and the general ordered him to select suitable subjects for the work from the Spanish and Portuguese provinces, and to go with them to Brazil as their superior. The band which Father Azevedo enlisted set out on June the 5th, 1570. The superior and 39, at first 42, others of the party were on a merchant vessel, the Santiago, and the others on one of a squadron of men-of-war going out under the command of Dom Luis Vasconcelos, governor of Brazil. They reached Madeira, and here Vasconcelos decided to stop for a time in order to get the advantage of more favourable winds. The master of the San Diego, however, intended to continue the voyage to the Canaries. This put Father Azevedo into a quandary. There was no room for the rest of the Jesuits on the other warships, but if he went on he would not have them under his care, and there was very grave danger from pirates. However, he decided to proceed with his ship, but seems to have had a premonition of what would happen, for before leaving Madeira he delivered a stirring address on the glory of martyrdom and warned his own party of their danger. When within a few miles of her destination, the Santiago was overtaken by a French privateer commanded by James Souris, an implacable Huguenot, who directly he heard of the convoy of Jesuits going to Brazil, had set out in chase from La Rochelle. The Santiago put up a good fight, and the missionaries helped in every possible way, short of bearing arms and shedding blood. After she was boarded, there was a fierce hand-to-hand struggle, but on the death of her captain, she was constrained to strike her flag. Thereupon Souris demonstrated his hatred of the Catholic religion by sparing the remainder of the crew and passengers, but ordering the death of the missionaries. Blessed Ignatius and his 39 companions were then and there brutally massacred in cold blood, meeting their death with heroism and joy. Their leader was thrown into the sea, clasping a picture of Our Lady given to him by Pope St. Pius V. Of these martyrs, 9 were Spaniards and the rest Portuguese. Several contemporary revelations of this massacre were reported, of which the chief were to Blessed Ignatius's brother, Don Jerome in the East Indies, and Saint Teresa of Avila, one of my favourite saints, whose kinsman, Blessed Francis Godoy, were among the martyrs. Their beatification took place in 1854. Saint Pompilio PIRROTTI, A.D. 1756. Pompilio Mary Pirrotti was born in 1710 of a good family at Monte Calvo in Campania. He had a good education, and struck by the need of schools, especially among the poor, he decided to give his life to teaching. He therefore joined the clerks regular of the religious schools, PIRROTTI or Scolopini, founded by St. Joseph Calasanctius for that work, and was professed in 1728, taking the name of Mary of St. Nicholas. He was ordained and taught for some years in Apulia, and then, on account of his sanctity and enthusiasm, was appointed missioner apostolic to Emilia and Venetia. At Naples, his zeal got him into trouble, and a campaign of slander and persecution was worked up against him by those who feared his influence or were jealous of his success. He was expelled from Naples, but such was the indignation of the people that the king had to revoke the decree of banishment. So St. Pompilio continued his work with a splendid patience until his superiors recalled him to the house of his order at Campo near Lecce, where he died at the age of 46. Ferdinand II, King of two Sicilies, took a keen interest in the cause of his beatification, which was achieved in 1890, and he was canonized in 1934. Sounds very holy person, doesn't he? So, returning over, just a moment. We're still on July the 15th. It's quite long, isn't it? Hold on a minute, I've got this cold. I can't help this, sorry. I've had this since the 1st of May. It doesn't show any signs of leaving me. Blessed Anne, Anne Mary, JAVOUHEY, Virgin, foundress of the Congregation of St. Joseph of Cluny, A.D. 1851. Of the many remarkable women beatified or canonized during the second quarter of the 20th century, one of the most outstanding was Anne Mary JAVOUHEY. She was born in 1779 at Jalanges in Burgundy, where her father was a well-to-do farmer, and she early showed the forcefulness of her character. Though the fifth of a large family, she dominated the rest of the children. Another characteristic that soon showed itself was courage, and during the Revolution she often helped clergy and others at no little risk. It was at Mass celebrated secretly in the house in 1798 that Nanette, as she was commonly called, made a vow of celibacy, together with a promise to devote her life to the education of children and help of the poor. When religious communities were again allowed in France, Nanette joined the Sisters of Charity at Besancon, but she had no vocation there. She went to the Cistercian nuns at Valsante in Switzerland with a like result. But here she was directed by a well-known monk, Dom Augustin Lestrange. He introduced the Cistercians into the United States, who told her that her vocation was to found a new congregation. Nanette had told him of her vision at Besancon of a room full of coloured boys and girls, and the voice which said to her, "These are the children God gives you. I am Teresa, and I will look after your congregation." So she returned to France, and Javouhey père, who alternated between opposition and a generous help of his daughter, set her up with rooms at Chamblanc, where she and her 3 sisters could start a school. When Pope Pius VII passed through Chalon in 1805, he received the 4 young women and gave them every encouragement. 2 years later, Anne, her sisters, and 5 others were clothed in a blue and black habit by the Bishop of Autun. Other schools and establishments were soon in demand, and in 1812 Mr. Javouhey bought a former Franciscan friary at Cluny to be the novitiate and mother house of the enterprise. A school was opened in Paris, where Mother Javouhey's educational methods excited comment, favourable and other, and brought her to the notice of the government. The governor of the island of Bourbon, now Reunion east of Madagascar, asked her to send some sisters there, and in September 1817 their first missionary school for coloured children was begun. This led to similar requests from elsewhere, and Mother Javouhey herself spent 2 years in Senegal, extending her work to Gambia and Sierra Leone to take over hospitals for the British authorities. She supervised the inauguration of a large plantation for Africans up the Senegal River and carried through a scheme for educating Senegalese in France for the priesthood. This last undertaking had eventually to be abandoned, and it was said with reference to it that Mother JAVOUHEY was before her time. The truth is just the opposite. Establishment of a native clergy is no new policy of 20th century popes, but a return to the earlier and normal practice of the Church in mission lands. With the passing of time, Nanette's youthful forcefulness became inflexible determination, and a girl's pluck became adult fortitude in a heroic degree. To these were added a clear and receptive mind and intellectual ability. Those qualities have their dangers, even for a fervent religious, but they were balanced by a simplicity and humility in her dealings with men and women, no less than towards God. This can be clearly seen from her simple charity combined with firmness when things went wrong. The period of schism among the sisters in Bourbon, the long and bitter disagreement with Bishop de Héricourt of Autun, and partly as a consequence of this, the extraordinary behaviour of the prefect apostolic in Guiana, who for 2 years deprived Anne of the sacraments. The cross is found wherever there are servants of God, and I rejoice to be reckoned among them, she said. But to the priest who refused her the sacraments as she left Guiana on her last voyage to Europe, she spoke out, "Very well, but if anything goes wrong, you will answer to God for it." If she received a heavy cross in French Guiana, There was also the field of Mother JAVOUHEY's most striking achievements. Her congregation already had establishments in Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint-Pierre, Pondichéry, hospitals, schools, workshops, and at Cayenne and New Angoulême in Guyana, when in 1828 the government asked her to undertake a task in which men had already failed badly: the colonization of the manor district there, with 36 sisters, a number of French artisans and prospective colonists, and 50 Negro labourers. She set to work according to a plan she had drawn up for the approval of the authorities. Those 4 years were doubtless temporarily the 4 hardest years she ever knew, planting not simply civilization, but a Christian civilization in the forests of South America. And as her success became apparent, doing it in the teeth of the jealousy of those in Guyana who had failed, and of lack of support from the government after the abdication of King Charles X in 1830, she was tireless as well as intrepid, and would buy up a score of runaway slaves to save them from the lash, or establish a village for lepers, as it were, in passing. Mother JAVOUHEY had not been back in France 2 years when an even more surprising service was asked of her. Much to the indignation of some of the Europeans, there several hundred Negro slaves in Guyana were to be emancipated. They were a rough lot, and their sudden freedom might lead to grave difficulties. Would Mother JAVOUHEY, during the time before their liberation, train them in the ways of true religion and civilized society? After much thought and more prayer, she replied that with God's help she would do her best. Nothing in her life aroused more general interest than this, and there were adverse criticism too. Lamartine, Chateaubriand, Lamennais all came to her defence, and King Louis-Philippe made the remark, "Madame JAVOUHEY is a great man." Back she went to Manor, and the Negroes were brought along in instalments as she was ready for them, not under armed guard as was proposed, but in charge of a nun. Praise the Lord. There were 200 men, 200 women, and 111 children, afterwards increased to around 600. Their day was mapped out almost like that of a religious community. The greatest domestic difficulty was their disinclination to work, but Mother JAVOUHEY took on herself to be foreman as well as guide, philosopher, friend, and magistrate. She was clearly going to justify in practice the abstract arguments in favour of emancipation, and the hostility of the French planters increased. They even bribed a Negro to upset a boat and drown the nun in the river. Mother JAVOUHEY was warned of this, but she would not defer the journey or change the crew. Nothing happened, and on May the 21st, 1838, the first 185 Negro slaves were solemnly and publicly freed. Hurrah! For each family a cottage, a piece of land, and a sum of money were waiting. Mother JAVOUHEY had looked after that, and also at their own earnest request, a pair of white man's boots. But never having worn such things before, they were quite unable to walk in them. Mother JAVOUHEY was now 64. Well, she's marvellous, isn't she? In 1843, she left Guyana and spent the last 8 years of her life supervising her now large congregation and arranging new foundations in Tahiti, Madagascar, and elsewhere, and the admission of Indian postulants in India. There was, too, ecclesiastical opposition to be met. She hoped to go to Rome to lay her work at the feet of the Father of Christendom, but she learned that I have a different journey in front of me, and I must make it alone. Anne Mary JAVOUHEY died. Do you know, it makes me want to cry. On July the 15th, 1851. She was beatified 99 years later, when the congregation she had founded had spread to 32 countries and colonies of the world. Isn't that moving? That's just so moving. I think that's the best saint that I've read of that's done such great work. I'm glad it was the last one because it's made me cry. I was very touched by that. That's what a saint. What a saint. My grandma was called Anne, but with no E. Yeah, that's made me cry, that saint. She was very unusual at that time, wasn't she? I mean, that was just God working through her. Incredible story. They should make a film about her. Her achievement was absolutely colossal. Absolutely colossal. That was definitely God's work. Way ahead of her time, wasn't she? Incredible. The love that she had for people and for slaves, and to do all that work. Absolutely incredible. Wonderful. Please pray for me, Saint. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much for listening. I was really, really moved by that saint's life. I'm going to read her again to myself and take it all in again. And as for Vladimir, I'm going to do that again on its own and put it out there because I think that they need to get Russia in perspective, because Russia has always claimed to be a Christian country. Yes, the communists are there, the leadership is communist, but the people are still Orthodox Christians, and they need to realise that they shouldn't be being maligned so maliciously. Anyway, thank you so much. That's gone longer than I planned to do, but I shall upload that now. And thank you for listening. Thank you for your comments. And we can learn from the saints, and they are worth listening to and hearing about, because we wouldn't have the faith we've got now if they didn't exist before us. God bless you all. I'm sending you God's peace in abundance. May you always be happy and joyful in the Lord. Bless the rest of your Sunday. Or if you're on Monday, have a good week. God bless.